It gives me also tremendous pleasure to introduce to you Cecilia Taiana, who comes to us from Ottawa in Canada. But this was not where she originally came from. Cecilia Taiana comes from Argentina, and she is a psychoanalyst in Ottawa. And she was an assistant professor at the Carleton University in Ottawa. She has published widely and many articles in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, which I think is quite a feat because they're known how difficult they are to accept articles. And she's written about the very topic that we're hearing about today several times, about mourning the dead and mourning the disappeared, and about very recently a trilogy about what does poetry offer psychoanalysis, in which she has looked at the work of Robert Frost, T.S. Eliot, and Wallace Stevens. I can really very heartily recommend these articles to you. Cecilia is also one to write poetry herself and has published some of them. And we're very lucky to have her here today. And I wanted to make one more connection to yesterday's event, because what you will talk today to us is about how difficult the process of mourning is when somebody disappears. And this, I think, connects very well with what we learned yesterday from Mina Antova, is what happens when a building disappears in Vienna and how long it takes to maybe find it again. Mm-hmm. So thank you very much, and please welcome Cecilia Taiana.
Thank you. But it is me who be thanking, and I like to thank the conference planners with whom it's been a pleasure to be in touch all these months, the Freud Museum, and feel very grateful to have been invited. And above all, I want to thank Jean, who understood my paper as being a mediating object of my own mourning, and because nothing is linear about my progress, as Pontalis told us, I want to thank Angela Soa, with whom I met in California, and walking under the Californian sun, we started talking, and it was Angela who introduced me to Jean, so I am here thanks to her.
In Buenos Aires.
Later.
Oh.
So I feel rather moved actually to be allowed to speak these words of mine in the rooms of Freud, because in many ways psychoanalysis saved my life. So for me to be able to do this, it has a lot of meaning. Mm-hmm. So I wrote this article after talking to many psychoanalysts in Argentina who work with the families and relatives, friends of the disappeared. And I came to an understanding that I wanted to take some of the things that he said further, because they designated the process as being a special process of mourning without the body. And I wanted to get into the weeds of what do we mean by special. So that was my fragment. The fragment was this word special. I started trying to unravel that from my own understanding. I didn't realize I was doing it for myself after, it's only an après-coup that you realize that you're doing it for yourself. So Freud's interest in the impact of death on the living goes back further than mourning and melancholia. In Totem and Taboo, Freud noted that ambivalence of the emotions we experience in relation to the dead. In this paper, I focus on mourning and melancholia as a landmark in the understanding of both normal and psychopathological aspects of mourning and depressive processes in human beings. Mourning and melancholia bridges Freud's first and second topographical theories of the psychic apparatus and constitutes for many authors a foundation of his theory of internal object relations. With this psychoanalytical understanding of mourning as a framework, I discuss special mourning processes such as those confronted by psychoanalysts in Argentina when treating the relatives of thousands of people who were disappeared by the military dictatorship in the 1970s. They are special in the sense that the external reality, which constitutes the starting point of the psychic mourning process, as described by Freud, is absent. I argue that the absent presence of the body as an enigmatic message initiates a special mourning process that bears certain characteristics of and is isomorphic to Laplanche's seduction theory. Death and the work of mourning. Death, as Freud wrote, the great unknown, the gravest of all misfortunes, is present throughout many of his texts. However, it is important to note that in the Freudian unconscious we do not know our own death. In our unconscious we are immortal. The question of death, in the sense that we are all subject to its enigma, is not primal for psychoanalysis. Jean Laplanche expressed this very point in his interview with Cathy Caruth. Quote, "It is the other's death that raises the question of death, not the existentialist question, why should I die? The question, why should I die, is secondary to the question, why should the other die? Why did the other die?" End of quote. Typically, we experience the death of the other before we encounter our own. Indeed, to experience the permanent absence of the other requires us to disinvest, that is, disinvesting at the psychic level of the representation of the other as an internal possession. This process presents us with a complex and challenging experience, reminiscent of and isomorphic in structure to early developmental losses. For loss to become an absence presence, the work of mourning has to be undertaken. For a deeper understanding of mourning and melancholia, I found helpful to reread Totem and Taboo, where the notion of indeterminacy of meaning appears in Freud's concepts of ambivalence. Freud entitled the second chapter of Totem and Taboo, Taboo and Emotional Ambivalence. In it, he discusses how the prohibition imposed by ancient taboos concern actions for which there existed in human a strong desire. Thus, in spite of taboo prohibitions, the original pleasure to do the forbidden continues in the unconscious. According to Freud, mostly as a conflict that results in an ambivalent attitude towards taboo prohibitions. Freud argued, quote, "In their unconscious there is nothing they would like more than to violate them, but they are afraid to do so. They are afraid precisely because they would like to, and the fear is stronger than the desire." Later in the same paper, Freud examines in particular the ambivalence of emotions in mourners and the cultural practices that embody this ambivalence. He starts the section, Taboo of the Dead, with the following sentence: "We know that the dead are powerful rulers, but we may perhaps be surprised when we learn that they are treated as enemies." End of quote. He then set himself to understand why and how, in early cultures, the dead loved ones became demons of sorts. After describing the treatment of the dead and the prohibitions therein in several geographically unconnected cultural groups, he concluded that these practices, quote, make no disguise of the fact that they are afraid of the presence or of the return of the dead person ghosts. And they perform a great number of ceremonies to keep him at a distance or drive him away, end of quote. Freud speculated that the ambivalence is supported by an unconscious conflict between the loving and the hostile emotions towards the dead and loved one. The taboo of the dead, he adds, originates from the opposition between the conscious grief and the unconscious satisfaction at death. End of quote. The mourning resolves this wrangle by projecting out the hostile aspect of his conflict into the dead spirit in the form of a malignant persecutory object. In this manner, Freud considers he, quote, succeeded, as it were, in getting behind the demons, for he explained them as projections of hostile feelings harbored by the survivors against the dead. This process, which is in early culture, is embodied primarily in cultural practices and rituals, is later internalized as the psychological processes of mourning, and gives rise to a specific process of internal object relations, which is primarily psychological and described for the first time in Mourning and Melancholia. By transforming this cultural practice into primarily psychological processes, modern man dispenses of demons, but not of his ambivalence. If, quote, this unknown hostility in which we are ignorant and of which we do not wish to know is not projected from our inner perceptions into the outer world, and is thereby detached from our own personal attributed to other, where does it go if it's not deposited onto external demon? If the mourning does not defend himself against it by displacing upon the object of hostility, namely the dead, as a projection, how is this hostility worked through, and how does the mourning resolve the ambivalence? And furthermore, what psychological processes engage this ambivalence? In psychoanalytical terms, mourning has a very distinct psychic task to perform, namely to detach the memories of libidinal investment of the survivors from the dead. This process, according to Freud, generates under the influence of the reality principle or the reality test. Quote, reality testing has shown that the love object no longer exists, and it proceeds to demand that all libido shall be withdrawn from the attachment of that object. Or in the radical words of French psychoanalyst Jean Laplanche, quote, the purpose of the work of mourning is to kill the dead. In other words, the mourning disinvests himself from the external world and intensifies his psychic investment in the internal world in an effort to keep the object alive. This process transformed the ego in the sense that during the initial denial of the loss of the object, the effort to keep it cathected is accompanied by a splitting of the ego. The mourner's ego, quote, is faced with a highly cathected mental representation of the love object on the one hand, and with the absence of physical and emotional perceptions of the object on the other. The splitting is a compromise that acknowledges both realities. As the mourner hallucinates the object through reminiscence, he has to acknowledge at the same time that acts of love can no longer be exchanged with the absent object. After some time, Freud tells us, normally respect for reality gains the day, as the reality of the object loss is accepted. In the interest of time, and given your familiarity with this paper of Mourning and Melancholia, I have drastically shortened my discussion of Freud's Mourning and Melancholia, which can be read in the published article. I will focus only on the aspect of mourning that I will revisit later in my presentation. Freud tells us there is a fundamental difference between normal and pathological mourning, on the one that originates in the change of the direction taken by the libidinal cathexis, In normal mourning, the individual is able to give up the lost object and withdraw libido from it, so that this libido, now free, can attach itself to new objects. In melancholia, however, the individual does not withdraw libido from the object. The ego devours the object in fantasy in order not to separate from it, in order to be one with the object, a narcissistic identification. This change of direction taken by the libido is the differential feature of Freud's understanding of melancholia. James Krejci, in his editor's note for the Standard Edition, remarks that, quote, Freud seems later to have regarded as the most significant feature of this paper was its account of the process by which, in melancholia, an object cathexis is replaced by identification. In mourning, we lose the otherness of the other, and the loved one becomes an internal absence presence. In melancholia, we lose the sameness of the other. We lose part of ourselves, or when loving the object implies being the object. The individual thus faces a painful struggle in his attempt to acknowledge the reality of the loss. Etymologically, this understanding of struggle is present in the Spanish word of mourning, duelo, which has two Latin roots, dolus, pain, and duellum, duel. The latter is in turn derived from two words, duo, meaning two, and bellum, meaning war. Etymologically speaking, then, mourning is pain that arises from combat between two people at war. Translated into psychoanalytical terms, this combat is between the two sides of a split ego, in mourning between the introjected object and the self, and in melancholia between the ego being the object and the ego as object of the critical agency. With this psychoanalytical understanding of mourning and melancholia as a framework are now turned to special mourning processes, such as those confronted by Argentinian psychoanalysts, treating relatives of thousands of people who were disappeared by the military dictatorship in the 1970s. They are special in the sense that the external reality, which constitutes the starting point of the psychic mourning process, as described by Freud, was absent, i.e., the inert body. Mourning the disappeared. According to Freud, confirming the loss of the external reality constitutes the starting point of the psychic mourning process. In this process, which involves a rather slow and sustained reality testing, in the case of the disappeared persons in Argentina, the object is absent because the external reality did not offer evidence of death, but only of sudden disappearance. The absence of the body was fully enigmatic. For those left behind, quote, it was impossible to know why the persons had been abducted, where the loved ones were, what they were being submitted to, whether they were alive or dead, and if they had been murdered, where the remains were. In addition, the very act of searching for information was dangerous, and many of the relatives of the disappeared, in their desperate search, became their lost object. First, let me offer a brief account of the historical context. In Argentina, the turbulent decade of the 1970s culminated in a bloody dictatorship installed by the military coup in 1976. This regime lasted 7 years, and during this period, thousands of individuals died or disappeared. Others were forced into exile, and those who remained were subjected to rigid censorship. A forced disappearance occurred when a person was secretly abducted or imprisoned by paramilitary forces with the authorization and support of the state, followed by an official refusal to acknowledge the person's fate and whereabouts, with the intent of placing the victim outside the protection of the law. Forced disappearance implied murder and in almost all cases torture. When the victim was killed, the body was destroyed or hidden. The corpse was disposed of in such a way as to prevent it ever being found, as that the person apparently vanished. Since there was no body to prove that the victim had actually died, the reality of their fate was held in suspension. During this period, not only were armed subversives killed, but many political dissidents, such as journalists, students, writers, filmmakers, artists, physicians, psychologists, were illegally abducted and detained in clandestine detention centers where they were questioned, tortured, and sometimes killed. Whenever female captives gave birth, their children were taken away immediately upon delivery and secretly given to military families. It is estimated that there were 500 children either kidnapped together with their parents or born in clandestine centers and then appropriated. Many of the illegally detained were heavily drugged and taken on airplanes far out over the Atlantic Ocean, into which were thrown alive with heavy weights tied to their feet. The hallmark of the operation was secrecy and the destruction of the body. Without any dead bodies, the government could easily deny any knowledge of the captive whereabouts and refute again and again accusations that they had been abducted and killed them. People murdered in this way are today referred to as the disappeared, los desaparecidos, and this is where the modern usage of the term derives. The unfinished business between the living and the dead is not an inert affair. Far from lifeless, the representation of the dead disappear haunts the mind, the absent body creating an internalized spectral presence. The dead inhabit the minds of the living, and the absence of the body haunts the subject who is unable to bury the dead once and for all, either physically or psychologically. Dead and alive at the same time, the dead disappear do not cease to impinge on the world of the living. In this state of affairs creates a subject in a state of refusal to mourn and latent mourning at the same time. For closer to the process by which grief is overcome, the mourner continues to experience the traumatic loss of the other and of the self. Given uncertain presence of the dead disappear, the process of exploring the internal presence of what no longer exists is barred from taking place. This means, in the case of the relatives of the disappear, they are also unable to experience the presence of what does not yet exist. What Emmanuel Levinas calls the awaited certainty that death is the without response. The disappear body is not the without response, the inert body that gives us nothing, but the disappear is now inside the mind of those who knew him, as well as roaming outside the world rather than resting in a silent grave. The survivor's subjectivity is permeated by this spectral presence that demands action. Such enigmatic mourning is a riddle that presents the indeterminacy of an oracle and launches the mourner into a labyrinth experienced, space, and designed by the other. Significantly, this other is not only the disappear loved, but also the regime. The enigma speaks from two constituencies, that is, it has two addresses towards the same addressee. The disappear of the loved one with a personal and intimate love for the disappear, including all the longings, regret, and possible idealization of the loved disappear, and the perverse violence of the regime. These cruel and sadistic actions remain for the relatives of the disappear in the domain of the imaginary, hyperactivating the fantasy of sadistic perversions of the invisible perpetrator of the state. The mourning of the disappear is thus like an infant, elaborating the primal scene in the darkness of his room, filling in the gaps of understanding of the violent movement behind the wall. This sadistic ideation eventually enters into a masochistic loop, since the survivor cannot stop these intrusive fantasies, incarcerating the libido in this repetition. If such a disappearance is an implanted enigma, it carries a secret and a mystery, so the case could be made that is isomorphic to the enigmatic signifier proposed by Jean Laplanche in his formulation of Freud's seduction theory. Laplanche argued that Freud's seduction theory is a truly general theory of the origins of the repressed unconscious. That is, it is more than a mere etiological hypothesis about neurotic symptoms. It tells us how the unconscious comes into being. In describing the subjective and intersubjective beginning of mental life, Laplanche theorizes that the encounter with the enigmatic signifier of the first other, typically mother, initiates the creation of the unconscious. The message transmitted by the adult first other, caregiver, is a key first encounter. For Laplanche, this encounter is not limited to forms of somatic contact between the adult and the child. Rather, it has a communicative function. It goes beyond a matter of simple excitation of the erotogenic zones to include the contribution of fantasy on the part of the adult. Laplanche insists on the fact that adult-enfant dialogue, as reciprocal as it may be, is nevertheless parasited by something else from the beginning. The adult message is scrambled by the unconscious of the adult. The adult-enfant situation, in spite of its reciprocity, is asymmetrical on the sexual plane, in the sense that on the side of the adult and in a unilateral direction, there is the intervention of the unconscious, insofar as the adult-infant situation is a situation that reactivates those unconscious infantile drives in the adult. This Laplanche calls the fundamental anthropological situation. We can't escape it. The infant, according to Laplanche, is the recipient of the conscious, preconscious messages of the parents. These messages are accompanied by the parent unconscious, is like a noise in the sense of communication that comes to perturb and to compromise the conscious, preconscious message. This means that the sexual, covert aspect that travels as a clandestine passenger within the otherwise well-adapted message of attachment. The intrusive impact of the adult other is always traumatic, and he or his message always in need of decoding. This first message remains initially uninterpreted or unassimilated and persists in the form of the question, what does the other want of me? Against this message, Laplanche argues, interiority was first created. He claims that the ego was first formed to cope with the strangeness of the message. Following this reasoning, the extended notion of seduction proposed by Laplanche applies, I argue, to the situation encountered by the survivor, who is unable and unequipped as the infant to process the absence full of communication they encounter. Once the disappear has taken place, this situation is not different from normal mourning, that is, exchanges are not possible. However, the non-response of the disappear body leaves behind the third reality of the enigmatic message. Laplanche speaks of the enigmatic message as a third reality between mother and infant. This interaction is not equal. It is perplexing and impenetrably implicit communication that is overloaded with significance for the infant and the adult. Such messages implant themselves as foreign bodies, haunting questions in the child's psyche. The implantation of the enigma is in our case an intromission. Following Laplanche, it is a forceful entry. However, it is not only an intromission of the unconscious content of the other, but the intromission of an absence. It is an absence that demands the restitution of the presence, that demands to be filled with a pregnant weight, is filled with active reminiscence and fantasy. The void of the absent does not stay void, it demands content, i.e. full present, it exceeds the ability of the subject to symbolize it. In our case, the psychic apparatus has to contend with two monumental tasks. One is to become, as the child, a researcher to figure out the enigma, and the other is figuring out what to do with this violent intromission of the other as perpetrator of the act, how to conceive of the figure of a violent third. The survivor, like a child, cannot tolerate the unknown and turn himself into a researcher, positing many hypotheses to complete his incomplete knowledge of the violent act. The survivor does not accept the incomprehensibility of the enigma, and a constant elaboration of possible hypotheses are tested to resolve it. For example, a patient had a brother who disappeared. The mother of the patient, unable to endure the enigma any longer, started to go to a clairvoyant, an activity that had never interested her before. Help was sought from one who sees clearly, a seer who could gain information through means other than the known senses. The function of the enigma is then to allow the presence of the absence to speak. In this sense, all death bring an enigma, because the question always remains, what would he or she be saying now? What would he or she have done, said now? Hardly ever without a regret or remorse for not having been able to speak with the other enough, for not having heard what he or she had to say. I postulate that the survivor of the disappear had to do this work. Similarly to the original founding of the ego, they must build an ego structure that can bind this new unknown enigmatic message, one that creates for the ego a new position that circulates around the enigmatic message of the disappear. The ego is taken over by the traumatic invasion of the enigma that needs to be decoded. In this case, it is the absence full of communication, and in this translation, to use Laplanche's term, the ego is transformed. The special mourning process, in short, is essentially an unresolved ambivalence to this attack of the enigmatic message. The enigma demands the question, why this? Why did it happen to me? How do I create ways to symbolize this? Since the reality of the disappear itself is equivocal and deliberately ambiguous as to why and by whom it was executed, reality cannot gain the day. The purpose of the work of mourning, to kill the dead, is that suspended. Instead of speaking less and less of the one who is not here anymore, the survivor often speaks about him more and more, to the point of neglecting the living. That part of the message that can only be apprehended in his absence leaves a linguistic internal presence that speaks and demands to be heard. His absence implants his message at the center of the ego of the survivor, which orbits around the absent's presence. Often, the mourning constructs a meticulously obsessive archive of the actions of the disappear, his life events and words, which are repeated and circulated with the currency of the living. This continuous reference to the disappear as alive and not dead set up a space of non-mourning, which functions as a constant petition for a writ of habeas corpus, i.e., to produce the disappear alive or face the court of law. The libido remains in these reminiscences. The disappearance is kept alive by creating an intense ideation surrounding the disappearance, for example, by preserving all the disappeared objects in a sanctuary of sorts, keeping their bedrooms intact, with all the possessions and clothes. Many of the survivors also created a space of non-mourning by circulating the absence as presence in language. For example, never using the past tense when referring to the life of the disappeared, assuming he was alive rather than allowing the reality of his death to appear. The libido is energetically invested in the search, which becomes a lab object revealed in endless conversations and in voracious exploration of different public offices and other places that could provide clues. This intense search at the same time modifies the lab object by bestowing heroic characteristic to the disappeared loved one. It is also modified by purifying the memory of the disappeared of all conflict or disappointments that might have existed prior to disappearance, as well by idealizing and in some cases devaluing them, their political struggle, and attaching a magnifying significance to every detail of their disappearance. As time goes by, the split continues, and the survivor experiences the pull between two contradictory aims. On the one hand, to acknowledge the tagging force of life, there is the need to grant the actual status to the disappeared, to keep the disappeared as final and give up the effort to translate the enigma. On the other, the ego is compelled to continue an intense internal psychic investment in memories and reminiscence in search of clues to sustain the frenetic, devoted, relentless external search for meaning, with all its dead ends, false clues, and red herrings. The acceptance of the disappeared thus brings about profound feeling of guilt, shame, and inadequacy. Indeed, when the enigma is repressed, in extreme cases, it can become a psychotic persecutory enclave. The continuation of the search increasingly constitutes a quest that drains the psychic energy of the survivor into a lifeless state, since he fails to get rid of an internal persecutory thanatic object that is supposed to pleasure and life. Thus, love and hate, veneration and hostility all rise out of the other's disappearance. To solve this painful ambivalence, many of the relatives of the disappeared transform the object catexis into an identification. It was a form of liberating from the external presence of the absent object the cause of their suffering, and echo Freud's description of mania, seeking like a ravenously hungry man for new object catexis previously invested in by the disappeared. This ravenous being is in all of us. Psychoanalysis reminds us that absence is constitutive. Psychoanalysis, in essence, an experience of absence. An absence we as psychoanalysts often rush to give a cause, the lost object, or to explain a process such as mourning or castration. But the very notion of representation implies an absence. Pierre Fedida says that everything we call psychic is woven by absence. It is this absence that is irreducible to an assignable absence and yet constitutive to the human subject. This constitutive absence paired up with the violent disappearance of a loved one was for many too much to bear. Laplanche says trauma is too much other. In this case, it is the threat of ego colonization and destruction by the external absent presence haunting other. The survivor is trapped in an internal and external wrangling with ambivalence, unable to initiate the psychological process of mourning described by Freud. The responses often change over time, and those depressed became enraged, or the enraged in turn depressed, and denial became a political tool more than a hope for undoing the act. Denial, melancholia, and rage were present in all cases in one form or another, at one time or another, And in this way, we can say that these processes were truly special. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this very powerful and very moving paper. As Cecilia Taiana already alluded to, her original paper is far longer.
Far longer.
And if you want to read it, you can read it in the International Journal in 2022. 14, but then also one now in 19...
No, the one of Machine of the Same is on the discourse of the regime, which is a very interesting discourse, and that is in 22.
Because there was
24.
There was another, I think one of the things I remembered that you had to leave out was not only were the people that disappeared, one didn't know how they died, but you said in your longer paper that the government also kept telling them different stories.
Yes.
And would make them think that they could meet them.
Yes.
And on top of not leaving them to mourn them, giving them no information, I think that was even a further perverse way of dealing with
This is one of the paragraphs that I took out in order to make it shorter, but it is an example that the relatives of the disappeared will receive telephone calls in saying he's dead. And then a few months later, he said he's alive, but we did this and this and the other, or describing the torture. And then, they will have periodic communications. So that's what you were referring, that sort of in order to keep them in that place of intense pain. Yes, and so I have many examples here in some of the paragraphs. Of course, you can read in the article, but this idea of the identification, the object-attentive transfer to identification is so correct in Freud, and it happened in this. One case that I cite is two brothers, and they were both interested in politics, and before the disappearance they were interested in opposite sides of the spectrum of the politics. One disappears, and the other one becomes so identified with the life of the disappeared that changed political party, changed marriage, changed location of living, changed profession. He became the disappeared in a way, or tried to become disappeared. These situations like this, and then there was also in part of the families a rift around the younger siblings resenting the dedication and devotion, because the activity of the mothers, the mothers of Plaza de Mayo that became international famous, there were many, he was just waking up in the morning and going to these Kafkanian kind of activities of lining up for 3 or 4 hours to come to a counter to ask for something to be denied, right? So on the following day they did the same thing. So their investment was completely on the search of the disappeared, and they neglected all the siblings. So when the siblings grew up, they began to have hostile notions towards what have this brother of mine or sister of mine have done to our family, and so there was divisions in the family on account of that. Beyond political conception, it was about the investment, the opportunity cost of this activity that the parents engage in. So it had many ramifications, and then organizations were formed, the plazas of mother that went to the central square in front of government and did a circle every Thursday. Then there is the organization of the children of the disappeared, and so it went through society, shaping decades to come. decades to come. But we see that in other cases as well.
Mm. We have a time for just a few questions from the audience. Alexei.
Thank you. I guess it's probably related actually to the comment that Jean also made, but I'm curious about the structure of the state's disavowal. So disappearance is basically a structure of disavowal,
Yes.
where it basically produces a situation where the victim knows, of course, what's happened, but the state can disavow it. And this often, as you were saying, also then engenders this sort of imaginary, an imaginary, it kind of amplifies this imaginary identification that often is then serves as an aggressivity against the victim's own ego.
Yes.
Insofar as that then they can develop a kind of persecution complex.
Absolutely.
And so I guess the larger question, I think it maybe also relates to maybe the first paper, would be, if how I'm understanding this, that it is in fact that what the structure of disavowal is doing is allowing for a regression to an imaginary position, which then engenders aggressivity. And that is, in other words, ambiguity precisely engenders possibilities for further aggression that's often internalized.
That's right.
So that, in other words, the issue would be is that there's a kind of requisite necessity for a symbolic determination that reintroduces, a kind of a cut,
Yes.
recognition of absence. So this is why I was kind of curious too about, maybe this goes back to the first paper about the way in which you were interpreting the dream. Because there's, in some sense, I was wondering is that, that there's maybe I misunderstood what you're doing, but it seemed like you were sort of talking about a sort of trajectory in your own practice that moved towards the cultivation of more, appreciating ambiguity. But it does seem like it can also then have this sort of effect of inducing aggressivity that can be directed either at the analyst or, for that matter, at themselves, And the question also being is then disavowing, it allows the patient to also disavow, let's say, the critical context, which is obviously what the state here is doing, which seems like one way of also interpreting this moment of the dream that was, really fascinating about the patient being a cog in the machine, which you sort of interpreted also in terms of them positioning you, but it's obviously then positioning you in reflection to how, let's say, society as such is positioning them. And that there's a kind of, then this allows for a disavowal of this social horizon, which is obviously always kind of implicit within the analytic context. And here it seems like it's serving, the way the state is operating is like it's serving an explicit ideological function, too. That disavowal is allowing the disavowal of a political situation that then allows for this psychologization of a political context that, it's maybe more of a comment, but.
Yeah, and maybe want to save also for our end discussion, yeah?
I do have a question, which is that, obviously in Catholic mythos, the body or at least traditionally needs to be buried on sacred ground in order to be guaranteed a future life, a future eternal life. So do you factor into your thinking about the special kind of reading here that there's a future tense at stake, indeed an eternal presence in the future? I know in Chile which went through the similar experience of the disappeared, there are women to this day with trowels going through the Atacama Desert looking for a bone, a femur, a knuckle, something, so they can bury it on church ground and guarantee their relative future eternal presence.
Yes.
So I just wondered how that mythos, which is active in Argentina, plays into your analysis of the need to continue to seek for the disappeared.
Right. And this is very much part of the other paper on the discourse, because the Catholic ideology figures a great deal. With respect of the mothers of the disappeared, they team up with the church, actually, and it's part of the church, because part of the church was with the regime, part of the church was against the regime, it was divided church. and the church kind of helped them create rituals to substitute of that. But there was also a forensic team of France. France sent a forensic team that was enormously effective. And they recognized many later on that were found. The point of view of the regime, they conceive of the disavowal as a strategic place to place themselves, because at the same time there was a number of people leaving the country. There was a lot of exiles. So their argument of the government was, they are not here, they are abroad. They are not here. Why do you think he's here? So they were enormously consistent in the refutation of their acts. But as the unconscious always returns, after democracy came, they found in the basement of one of the ministries a vault full of documents. So the Argentinians are not as rigorous as the Germans, of course, but they went that way too, that they had a lot of things. And I actually was in the archives that finally were created, which are called archives for the memory. And many of the things are documented, and particularly the reasoning of the regime, how they reasoned things. And that's my other paper. But yes, there was substitute rituals that the church helped them with. Very good.
Maybe one more question, Dennis?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Cecilia. Excellent paper, thank you very much. I wanted to ask you something which relates maybe to what you were saying about the archives.
Yes.
And specifically the relationship between the non-disappeared, or the survivors, the relatives,
Yes.
to the state.
Yes.
Because as you said, obviously, the risk in this impossibility of mourning is the creation of quasi-paranoid evil other,
Yes.
i.e. the state becomes that which knows what happened. I wanted to ask you, is there also like a different relation to the state? That is to say, is there a relationship between the family, the survivors, and the state, whereby they're put in this quite impossible position to say, well, maybe the state does not know it all. So whereby they are forced not only to construct an evil other, responsible, but also admit that that evil is alarmed, a banal evil. That is to say, maybe they do not really exhaustively know what happened, which would enhance the impossibility of mourning, right? I cannot find in the archives the specific papers of what happened to my loved one. So I was wondering whether that kind of relationship between the families and the state is also in the equation, or whether the fantasy, the reality of the evil state is the predominant one.
Yeah, well, I think what made me think your question is that we tend to speak of these events as in a one unified temporal unit. And in fact, what is important when you get into the archives, into understanding the problem, you begin to understand it in a temporal way. So the idea that they know and they don't tell us was initially that. But if you go years later, and particularly in the après-coup of democracy coming back and look, you see the disorganization of cruelty. And so this section did this much worse than this other section. Remember, yesterday we had this notion that there were sections or neighborhoods, or we divided, Vienna was divided in, the same pattern was done there. So a neighborhood had this commando and this other, and many things happened here that don't happen here, and here they happen differently, and the timings were different. So you begin to get into the chaos of the administration of cruelty, and therefore some of that, comes. But the dance between the state and the relatives was that because there was this denial, in fact, the mothers sang around the plaza, con vida se los llevaron, con vida los queremos, which means with life they took him away, with life we want them back. So they are precluding the possibility of them being dead. So there is a denial of the possibility of mourning, and that was their existential stance, and it took a lot of their psychic energy to stay there, because the reality principle wants to gain this day, like Freud said, right? And they were resisting that, insisting on that. So this 4 o'clock in the morning kind of line up outside prisons, in the middle of the winter for 4, 5, 6, 7 hours, and then they arrive, and for some little excuse they are denied access, because some people were to jail, or not everybody disappeared, many of them went to jail as well. So they were denied, or they were an office where they would find a document, a birth certificate or whatever, and the same thing, it was denied at the last minute. So, but that didn't deter them. The following day they were in another office, it was a kind of water running over the stone, trying to erode it.
We do need to stop at this point if we want to try and keep
Yes.
things in time. No, but I'm going to take the prerogative of being the moderator, because I think there's also a really interesting link between your paper and the paper by Alessandra Lemmer yesterday, of this not being able to mourn, and teasing out of the other, on one hand, in Argentina in a very cruel way, to keep the dead alive. And yesterday in the paper that some of you missed, Lemmer was talking about what they were called, death grief boxes, where the pots, grief boxes, pots, yeah. You see how much I know about that, but grief pots, where the mourner is given the possibility through artificial intelligence to establish conversations with the dead one, and to have access to this at a very regular time. So it's another, if you throw it around, it's another way of keeping the dead alive, and creating that sort of, with, in your case, refugee songs, and in the case of seemingly not so refugee songs.
Yes.
So thank you very, very much.
It was good that you did that.